Sunday, May 22nd, 2011, 4:35 p.m. The city of Joplin in southwest Missouri seemed to be having a quiet day. Families were out for dinner, some were returning from church, others were simply enjoying the warm spring air. No one imagined that the heavens had already begun to conspire. Over the open plains of the Midwest, a supercell, one of the most dangerous forms of thunderstorm, was taking shape. Its core was fueled by moisture, heat, and a tension-filled atmosphere. What seemed like just another afternoon was about to become a lethal trap. This wouldn't be any ordinary tornado. It would be an EF5 monster, with winds that could tear concrete from the ground and steel from foundations. Over 1,600 meters wide, nearly 35 kilometers of continuous destruction. A colossus that wouldn't graze the outskirts or vanish into the countryside. This one would strike directly at the heart of an urban city. In minutes, life in Joplin would change forever, and the survivors would never be the same again. To understand what happened in Joplin on May 22nd, you must first look up. Not with romanticism, but with respect. Because the skies of the American Midwest are unforgiving. Beneath its vast immensity, some of the most violent storms on the planet form. And that afternoon, conditions were ideal for something extraordinary and lethal to happen. It all started with a supercell, a rotating, stable, and extremely powerful storm. It emerged south of Kansas, driven by a combination of warm air from the Gulf of Mexico, cold westerly winds, and a moisture-laden atmosphere. At first glance, it looked like just another storm, but meteorologists knew something wasn't right. At 4 o'clock p.m., radars began to show signs of rotation. At 4:35 a.m., the tornado touched down. What descended wasn't a simple funnel of air. It was a monstrous column, dense and dark, with a diameter exceeding 1,600 meters. An EF5 tornado, the highest level on the enhanced Fujita scale. That means sustained winds of more than 320 kilometers per hour. And this one exceeded them. In a matter of minutes, the tornado headed straight for the heart of a city with more than 50,000 inhabitants. Its path was clean, brutal, and straight, from west to east, like a scalpel on a map. It traveled nearly 35 kilometers, leaving a swathe of destruction visible even from space. The storm touched down just west of Joplin, near Schifferdecker Avenue, between the city limits and the quiet outskirts where open fields still remained. But that calm was short-lived. In just seconds, it leveled entire neighborhoods on the city's west side. Brick homes were disintegrated, foundations ripped out, and ancient trees bent like twigs. The tornado's fury moved eastward, entering the urban core with ruthless precision. The next victim was the South Main Street area, where family-owned businesses, gas stations, and small restaurants were reduced to rubble. It then moved toward one of Joplin's most iconic landmarks, St. John's Regional Medical Center. The imposing, solid structure was shaken to its core. Windows were blown out, walls collapsed, and even the heavy elevator tower was shifted several inches from its original axis. The hospital was rendered unusable and was evacuated in darkness, with stretchers amid broken glass and collapsed ceilings. The tornado continued its devastating march across Ranch Line Road, one of the city's busiest commercial arteries. Department stores, supermarkets, car dealerships, and national franchises were pulverized in a matter of minutes. Buildings that had stood for decades couldn't withstand the onslaught of that whirling beast. Vehicles were lifted like toys, thrown against structures, or stacked on top of each other like cardboard. East of Joplin, the storm weakened somewhat, but not before leveling schools, churches, and a handful of other homes in its path. The tornado eventually dissipated near rural communities in Jasper County, leaving behind a devastating landscape, a scar of destruction more than a mile wide, stretching like a fresh wound through the heart of the city. The tornado's path wasn't erratic, but determined. It carved a line of death from west to east, passing through the very soul of Joplin. In its wake, it destroyed more than 8,000 buildings, and forever altered the lives of tens of thousands of people. Every street it passed through was unrecognizable, and every minute of its passage was a deafening echo of wind, screams, and silence. After the roar came silence, a thick, almost sacred silence, as if time itself had been uprooted along with the trees. What remained standing weren't houses, nor tents, nor memories. Only fragments, splintered wood, bent sheets of wood, lives suspended in the air. There, among the wreckage, emerged the stories that would forever define Joplin's soul. When the EF5 tornado unleashed its fury on Joplin, one of its first victims was none other than St. John's Regional Medical Center, a hospital that served as a vital shelter for thousands of people. In a matter of seconds, what seemed like an ordinary day transformed into a relentless nightmare. The storm, with a violence as ferocious as it was unexpected, pounced on the hospital walls, battering them with a brutal force that seemed intent on demolishing not only the structure, but also all hope within its walls. Inside, the situation was critical. Patients in critical condition, many of them dependent on mechanical ventilators to keep their lungs moving, were fighting for their lives. Doctors, nurses, and hospital staff worked tirelessly, aware that every second counted. But then, just as the storm seemed about to split the building in two, the electrical system suddenly collapsed. The mechanical ventilators stopped working. A terrifying silence fell over the hospital, so profound it seemed to absorb all the air. Only the accelerated heartbeats of fear and uncertainty could be heard, echoing through the hallways like an ominous sound. And amidst this chaos, the medical staff transformed into heroes without capes, launching into a frantic race against time. With a strength and determination bordering on the superhuman, they began administering manual respiration to the patients, fighting to keep them alive with no help other than their own effort and willpower. As the structure creaked and groaned under the relentless pressure of the winds, emergency alarms blared incessantly, and windows exploded in a shower of glass, shards, and dust that filled the air. The hospital became a chaotic scene of survival. The hallways were transformed into a maze of rubble, but the battle within those walls continued with indescribable intensity. Every breath taken, every firm and determined hand held by a frightened face, was a small victory in the midst of disaster. It was an act of courage that defied the devastation raging outside, a symbol of human resilience in the face of unleashed nature. In the end, St. John's Regional Medical Center weathered the storm. Though forever scarred by that dark and brutal night, in those minutes of absolute chaos, an indelible story of courage, humanity, and hope was born. A story that continues to resonate, reminding us that even in the worst storms, the strength of the human spirit can shine with an unrelenting light. The testimonies did not stop. Cecil Cornish was no ordinary man. At 67, he had seen a lot in life, but nothing, and I repeat nothing, prepared him for what he was about to face. He lived in a quiet neighborhood just a few blocks from his city's bustling center, in a modest house that looked like something out of a postcard. A welcoming porch where he rocked in his favorite chair, a rose bush that burst into bright blooms every spring, and the peaceful silence of everyday life. But that night, the peace was about to be shattered in a way that only nature, in all its relentless fury, can achieve. Cecil had experienced tornadoes before. Yes, he'd heard the warnings, felt the wind howl, seen the destruction scar his community, but nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to what was coming this time. As the storm began to approach, a dark, swirling beast of wind and destruction, he couldn't help but think something that's forever etched in his memory. I thought it was the end of the world. And he wasn't exaggerating in the slightest. It wasn't a metaphor for fear. It was the harsh reality knocking at his door. Following every protocol that experience had taught him, Cecil took refuge in the place that seemed the safest inside his house. The bathroom bathtub. He closed the door firmly, covered his body with a mattress as a makeshift shield, and amid the roar that grew around him, he clung to hope and faith. He prayed. He felt the ground beneath his feet disappear. Not figuratively, but literally. The house began to rise, to detach itself from the ground, as if an invisible, brutal hand had grasped it and thrown it into the air. And then came the crash, that deafening sound of shattering glass, wind howling furiously, and a dull thud that seemed to mark the end of everything. Then, absolute darkness, an overwhelming silence. When he finally woke up, minutes after that nightmare, nothing was the same. Naked, wounded, and confused, he found himself lying on land he no longer recognized as his own. He had been dragged more than 100 meters by that murderous storm. His house, his refuge, had completely disappeared. Like his neighbors, swallowed by the void.
For weeks, Cecil's life became an uncertain back and forth between temporary shelters, fraught with the cruelest uncertainty. Where was his family? Were they still alive? No one could say for sure. But in the midst of that darkness, in the heart of loss, something incredible began to emerge within him. An indomitable will, a spark of life no one expected. "God let me live for a reason," he declared aloud, as if defying fate. That reason didn't take long to reveal itself. With the strength of someone who has hit rock bottom and decides to get back up, Cecil founded a small relief center inside a church that, miraculously, had withstood the tornado's fury. From that sanctuary of hope, he began to rebuild not only his own life, but also the lives of those who, like him, had lost everything. Every brick he laid, every wall he erected, was more than an act of construction. It was an act of faith, a defiant cry in the face of unleashed nature. Thus, amidst the destruction, a story of human resilience was born. Because sometimes, when the world seems to be ending, that's when the real battle begins. The battle of hope, the battle of those who refuse to give up and decide to turn disaster into a new beginning. Cecil Cornish didn't just survive a tornado, he became a living symbol of what it means to endure and rebuild. But not everyone enjoyed a rebirth. In other parts of the city, chaos erupted immediately, especially in the commercial district. Will Norton was barely 18, the age when the world seems to expand with infinite possibilities, when everything changed for him in the blink of an eye. He had just left his graduation ceremony, that celebratory moment that marks the end of one stage and the beginning of another filled with dreams and promise. Joy still beat in his chest as he drove alongside his father, cruising the familiar streets with the excitement of a future ahead. But the sky, which until that moment had been a tranquil blue canvas, began to turn dark, opaque, almost like an old black and white film, the kind of ominous shadow that announces something terrible is about to happen. Without warning, nature launched its most brutal and merciless blow. The last thing the Norton family heard was a desperate call, a cry on the verge of panic. "Dad, it's coming!" And in an instant that seemed suspended in time, the car they were driving was sucked into the monstrous force of the tornado right at the intersection of Main Street and 26th Street. That inhuman force, a vortex of wind, dust, and destruction, engulfed the vehicle like a leaf in the wind, snatching Will and his father from life as they knew it. Will didn't survive that fateful night. His body was found days later, lying in a ditch, several meters away from the vehicle that had been swallowed by the storm. The news shook the entire country. He wasn't just another young man. He was a symbol of life extinguished too soon, of dreams cut short, of that brilliant and charismatic youth lost in the chaos. Will Norton represented an entire generation that saw how, in a matter of seconds, the tornado's fury erased years of hope and promise. His story became a brutal reminder of human fragility in the face of nature's relentless force, but also a call to remember, to keep alive the memory of those left behind, and to recognize the value of every moment lived. Others, however, were trapped. At the Home Depot supermarket, a makeshift shelter for more than 100 people seeking to escape the impending horror. Moments of tension and desperation seemed like something out of an apocalyptic movie. People of all ages, entire families, friends, and strangers alike, huddled inside the building, hoping that the walls would protect them from the disaster. Some found refuge beneath the sturdy shelves packed with tools and materials, while others, in a desperate act of survival, hid in the cold, dark storage rooms, seeking a safe corner amidst the chaos. But nature showed no mercy. The tornado's fury was quick to take its toll. The building began to give way, and not slowly or gradually. It collapsed in on itself, crushed with the brutal force of an invisible hand that seemed to want to erase all traces of life. The screams and the roar mingled with the dust and debris covering the ground. Many died right there, trapped under tons of concrete and steel, while others, against all odds, managed to walk out from the wreckage, miraculously unharmed or barely injured. Among these stories of miracles and tragedy, one stands out, that of a pregnant woman who survived the collapse. In an instinctive act, she covered her belly with bags of fertilizer, cushioning the impact and protecting the life within. Her story became a symbol of hope and strength in the midst of disaster, a living testament that, even in the darkest moments, life can find a way forward against all odds. But the tragedy didn't end there. A few blocks away, another man was facing his own battle. He was buried under a pile of building blocks that the storm had violently thrown. Immobile, trapped in a confined space, he couldn't move or scream for help. But instead of giving up, he made a choice that meant the difference between life and death. With every breath, with every beat of his heart, he chose not to give up the fight. Hours later, when hopelessness seemed to have settled in, a group of volunteers heard a faint tapping against a metal pipe. It was the sign of life they were looking for. Guided by that almost imperceptible sound, they managed to find the trapped man and rescue him from the rubble. His survival became a story of courage and perseverance, a reminder of the power of human will in the face of extreme adversity. Joplin didn't give up. She didn't kneel in the face of tragedy. She didn't cry in silence, nor did she let the pain crush her into darkness. Instead, she screamed her heart out, clung to life tooth and nail, and dug through the rubble, searching for hope amidst the destruction. The shelters quickly filled with people, men, women, and children arriving exhausted, covered in dust and tears, but with an indomitable spirit. Sobs mingled with the noise of the wind that had already died away, while prayers rose in a silent chorus, pleading for survival. Mothers frantically searched for their missing children among the wreckage, while parents carried their pets wrapped in threadbare blankets, clinging to any symbol of normalcy that remained. And then the volunteers arrived. It didn't matter where they came from, some with boxes full of food for the hungry, others with flashlights illuminating the darkness of the destroyed streets, and many simply with open arms and hands ready to help. The entire city was transformed into a living organism, wounded but throbbing, a vibrant community determined not to disappear, not to let the storm take its spirit. The next morning, the devastation was absolute. The houses were in ruins, the streets were covered in debris, the silence interrupted only by the whisper of the wind and the distant echo of sirens. But what was also overwhelming was the solidarity that emerged with the same force as the destruction. The survivors didn't see themselves as heroes. They didn't feel they were. They were ordinary people, with fears and tears, who for some incomprehensible reason had been left standing. And what they feared most was being left alone in that landscape of desolation. A woman, who had lost her 2 children in the storm, refused to let despair overcome her. Instead, she set up a makeshift camp where she began distributing donated clothing to those in need. A teenager who had lost his grandmother tirelessly walked the streets with a blank notebook, carefully recording the names of the missing to help authorities organize a list that would honor the memory of those who were no longer with us. And in a devastated school, one teacher became a savior. With nothing but a flashlight in his hand and a firm promise, he walked through the ruined hallways to rescue 14 students trapped in the rubble. His voice, firm and full of conviction, told them again and again, "No one dies today." Stories began to emerge from all sides, each one more incredible than the last, a living testament to the strength of the human spirit when all seems lost. In less than an hour, the tornado forever changed the face of Joplin. But it was in the next 24 hours that the world began to look on in shock and horror. The devastation that engulfed that Missouri city was so vast, so absolute, that even the most experienced journalists couldn't fully comprehend what they were reporting. From major international networks like CNN, NBC, and ABC, to local broadcasters, community radio, and social media, everyone turned their attention to that strip of land that seemed to have been bombed from the sky. The first images that arrived were not from professional cameras, but from cell phones, shaky videos, nervous shots, black skies, and cries of despair. Soon, helicopters arrived to provide an aerial view that, while clear, only revealed an even deeper horror. From the air, Joplin looked like an open wound, a fresh scar etched into the earth. A jagged, lifeless line dividing the city in two, the before and the never again. The media tried to put words to what seemed impossible to describe. Headlines like "War Zone," "Catastrophic Destruction," and "Apocalypse in the Heart of America" filled the front pages. But no phrase was sufficient to convey the emotional weight of the tragedy. Because what had been destroyed wasn't just physical infrastructure. History, memory, an entire community, the soul of a place, had been lost. On social media, the impact was immediate and powerful. Twitter became a digital hub, a place where information flowed at breakneck speed. Hashtags like #PrayForJoplin, #JoplinTornado, and #HelpJoplin dominated global trends, connecting people around the world to the unfolding tragedy. Desperate families searched for their loved ones through posts pleading for news, while volunteers offered shelter, food, and transportation to those in need. Facebook was filled with digital albums where faces, names, and coordinates united in a network of hope and solidarity. Each photo was a story, each post a bridge between chaos and humanity. But this tragedy wasn't confined to the local level. It soon became a global media phenomenon. Everyone wanted to understand how, in the 21st century, an entire city could be reduced to dust in a matter of minutes. The answer, both fascinating and terrifying, lay in the relentless force of nature, reminding us how vulnerable we are to its power. And then came the production teams, those storytellers who transform chaos into narratives the world can understand. One of the most impactful projects was the documentary Twister, Caught in the Storm, broadcast on the Weather Channel. This work didn't just show stunning images. It was a painstaking, almost surgical reconstruction of Joplin's most dramatic moments. They used real-time radar imagery, capturing every twist and turn of the tornado with astonishing precision. They incorporated blood-curdling first-person accounts from those who saw the horror from the inside, who felt the roar and fury of the storm firsthand. And, to help the audience grasp the magnitude of the catastrophe, they used 3D animated recreations that traced the tornado's path, as if nature itself were drawing its own map of destruction. But it wasn't just a visual spectacle. This documentary was, at its core, a profound lesson in pure horror. It offered no consolation, no soft words to soothe the fear, only stark facts. The tornado's relentless path, the brutal speed with which it swept through everything in its path, the rate of destruction that seemed to defy all logic, and, of course, the death toll it left behind. All of this wrapped in a soundtrack that seemed to have been composed by the very black clouds that covered the sky that fateful afternoon. One of the documentary's most haunting moments came with the live coverage of the tornado. There was a storm chaser, a cold, seasoned veteran, who, for the first time, couldn't hold back his tears. Watching the funnel engulf an entire neighborhood, he murmured in a broken voice, "There were people there. There were lives there." The scene quickly went viral, not because of the tornado itself, but because of the silence that followed. The expression of helplessness on the face of someone accustomed to facing these beasts as if they were familiar enemies. That vulnerable, human moment resonated deeply with millions of viewers around the world. Meanwhile, other media outlets were doing their part. Hour-long specials, photo reports that showed the devastation in striking images, interviews with meteorologists who explained the science behind the phenomenon, segments that linked the storm's fury to the effects of climate change. But nothing could surpass the power of first-hand testimony, the raw emotion of those who lived through the tragedy. Television networks set up mobile studios on the outskirts of Ground Zero. From there, they interviewed survivors, local authorities, and tirelessly working volunteers. But what truly remained etched in the minds of those watching was what was happening in the background of each broadcast. Trees stripped of branches, roads blocked and aimless, children sitting on dirty mattresses with blank stares, like those who had just awakened from an endless nightmare. In a short time, Joplin became a powerful symbol, a symbol of vulnerability in the face of the relentless force of nature, an emblem of the chaos that can unfold in a matter of minutes. But above all, a monument to human resilience, to that ability to get up, rebuild, and move forward when all seems lost. However, the media coverage also exposed an uncomfortable truth. The fragility of early warning systems was laid bare. The lack of underground shelters in critical buildings was a critical vulnerability. The disconnect between issued warnings and actions taken exposed a systemic failure. Television showed not only what had happened, but also what could have been avoided. And in that revelation, the world received a wake-up call, an urgent warning to better prepare for the next storm. When the dust settled, Joplin looked like a badly drawn map. Streets that no longer led anywhere, houses that were no longer homes, schools without roofs, churches without bells. And yet, the first instinct wasn't to flee. It was to stay, to rebuild. But where do you start when there's nothing left? 48 hours after the tornado, President Barack Obama walked through Ground Zero. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a rolled-up shirt sleeves and a look of restrained awe. Around him, the debris was still smoking. He uttered a phrase that has stuck with him. "This is a nation that will not be defined by tragedy, but by its response to it." Reconstruction began almost immediately, not by decree, by will, by hands, by necessity. Architects, engineers, urban planners, they all came. What was designed wasn't a copy of the previous Joplin. It was a strengthened version, learned, improved. Building codes changed radically. From then on, new buildings had to withstand extreme winds. Underground shelters were required in all schools. Hospitals were relocated. City plans were redrawn to create more open spaces, more evacuation zones, more escape routes. The memory of what was lost became a guide for what was to be born. One of the most symbolic decisions was to preserve the surviving metal cross in the chapel of St. John's Hospital. That hospital had been completely razed. The ventilators failed. The walls collapsed. Life was suspended for minutes. But that cross, twisted and rusted, still stood. It was installed in the new medical center as a reminder that faith, sometimes, is also built of steel. And while the city was reinventing itself, something curious was happening at the other end of the bureaucracy. The so-called Waffle House Index was born. Yes, the name sounds like a joke, but it isn't. The Waffle House Index was proposed by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, after observing a pattern. If the Waffle House restaurant in an affected area was open, the disaster was manageable. If it was operating with a limited menu, the situation was dire. But if the restaurant was completely closed, it signaled a catastrophe. In Joplin, all 3 Waffle Houses were destroyed. Level red, maximum alert. The anecdote became a tool and a symbol. Because it wasn't just about food, It was about resilience, about infrastructure, about how quickly coffee could be served again, as a metaphor for how quickly a community could breathe again. For months, Joplin was a laboratory of public policies, of solidarity, of emotional reconstruction. The rubble was removed by the ton. But the most difficult reconstruction was the invisible one, the one that takes place in the souls of those who survived. For every house built, there was a loss that couldn't be replaced. For every new wall, a hole that couldn't be filled. But the people kept going, not out of heroism, out of instinct, because giving up wasn't an option. Children returned to school in portable classrooms. Churches held open-air masses, and every brick laid felt like an act of defiance, as if the city were shouting, "We're still here." Joplin wasn't rebuilt by big business or campaign promises. It was rebuilt by volunteers, by neighbors, by teachers, nurses, students. The tornado destroyed structures, but it also unearthed something deeper: the human capacity to begin again, with empty hands, but an intact heart. When the storm finally dissipated, what it left behind wasn't simply a ruined city, a collection of collapsed buildings and debris-strewn streets. What truly remained was something much deeper. A community marked by a challenge beyond physics. A community whose soul was being tested and, above all, exposed. Joplin, that name that had once been just another dot on the sprawling map of Missouri, was transformed into a powerful symbol of resilience, a living emblem of the human capacity to rise after the most brutal blow. The young people, who until then had lived oblivious to the tragedy, removed from the harshness of the disaster, became tireless volunteers. The time of day, the fatigue, or the pain didn't matter. The days following the tornado were an endless marathon where there were no schedules or breaks. Only hands that cleaned with fervor, arms that lifted debris with strength, hearts that held others with hope. It was a network of solidarity that stretched throughout the city, invisible but relentless, sustaining every person, every family, every street. The fragmented and devastated city learned to unite with an urgency that seemed to break through the barriers of fear and pain. Each neighbor became a cornerstone, an indispensable piece of the invisible wall that held everyone together. It wasn't a comfortable or easy union. The wounds, both visible and invisible, didn't heal immediately. The scars left their mark and will remain for a long time. But despite everything, that wall grew, unstoppable.
And in the midst of that immense pain, a force was born that didn't appear on any weather radar or measure on any scale of intensity. It had no name or number, but it was palpable in every gesture, in every act of daily courage. A force that defied destruction, that shouted to the world that Joplin was still there, alive, determined not to be erased. This story doesn't end with a simple message or a heroic or miraculous ending. It's not a tale of saviors or a traditional happy ending. It is, above all, a vibrant and raw testimony to human nature when it faces the abyss, and despite everything, decides to take a step forward. It is the story of will, that invisible but indestructible force that no storm, no matter how fierce, can ever erase. Because in the end, empty words, cold numbers, and even the most devastating storm don't matter. What truly endures, what survives any disaster, is that will to keep going. That indomitable flame that burns in every person who says, "Here I am, and I'm not going to give up." And that flame, that will, is what makes Joplin a story the world will never forget. If you want to discover more shocking stories about the power of nature, follow the most extreme phenomena up close, and understand how the power of man and storms clash time and time again. Subscribe to Extreme Tornado. Here, the truth doesn't stop with the storm. Stay with us so you're always one step ahead, prepared for the unexpected.